subject, which is it's something in my garden, actually. And I'll explain it as it goes on. But I wanted to demonstrate what's involved in outdoor painting, and this is something I've thought of painting for a long time. These two objects in this corner of this path. So now I'm ready to start my painting. You will notice that I have all my colors that I ever use are around the side of the palette, ready to mix. But the palette that I'm starting with for this painting is built around mostly reds and greens, and as limited as I could make it and still embrace what I think are most of the colors here. Or at least in the beginning of the painting, nothing will be done except with this limited palette that I chose, because there's a lot of red, orange, and there's a lot of green, from blue-green to sort of a yellow-green. This is actually yellow-green. And I figure all the intermediate colors, because these are opposites, I can make up a lot of the neutrals and intermediate colors from this array here, which is what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to make a fairly neutral color. Not dark, but not super dark. And I'm going to start drawing on the canvas. So it's kind of noisy out here. I hope between the birds and the neighbors, I hope you'll be able to hear me. If not, I'll have to open it later. So the first thing I'm doing is just to block in some of the shapes as quickly and loosely as I can. And as with the previous painting, I'm using direct measurements, which will embrace perfectly the subject. Because not only does it make things a lot easier, but you can check your errors really quickly. You can locate your errors, and there are enough other problems when you're working, especially when you're trying to do a realistic painting, without struggling with the accuracy of the drawing. And this enables you to avoid that problem. So I recommend people doing this. You just take measurements with your brush, keeping your brush at right angles to your line of sight, and then you transfer them directly to the canvas. And you can also hold your brush against lines, and if you don't change the angle of your brush and just transfer it over to the canvas, you can get a much clearer sense of for instance, the perspective lines, which is quite important for placing things. Here I'm seeing the way I've set it up. Okay. So even doing this, it's a little tricky. This is something that's been in my garden forever. This the horse skull and the sculpture of a fish from Michoacan that was brought to me from my friends, where I take people painting in Michoacan. So I'm ready to start laying in the color, having got a very crude, fairly accurate drawing, which focuses on these objects here. Now, the lighting's going to change radically. I'm probably going to have to do this in 2 sessions, 2 hours today and 2 hours tomorrow, because the light will change so radically. But I'm going to start blocking in some of the darker areas with color that's somewhat muted, and I'm muting it by neutralizing it with its opposite. So that the reason for the somewhat muted color is so I have a range that I can work as I move forward. And actually, if you, even the Impressionists, who are famous for all their bright color, very often blocked in with somewhat more muted color. You can see this in some of the paintings by Monet that he didn't finish. And I'll try and find one of those to show you. I spend a long time just walking in areas. And now the ground is much cooler. So I'm gonna, and yellower. So I'm using this yellow green here. The shadows in the back are much closer to neutral and quite dark. So I'm taking my red block in. Again, not black. Because we want the painting to glow, and we don't want to get into colors that kind of make holes in the canvas, especially when you're working outdoors where there's a lot of light. We want that to be something that we see when we look at the painting, the luminosity of the painting. So we're not doing a chiaroscuro painting. Even though I'm blocking in the shadow areas right now, I'm going to keep it lighter than most chiaroscuro paintings would be. Because otherwise it's, you know, we can't do the kind of soupy dark brown field for the whole painting that the chiaroscuro painters did without kind of killing the luminosity and the vibrancy of the scene. My paintings tend to be a cross between, to some extent, a cross between Impressionist and chiaroscuro work, in the sense that I use certain concepts in Impression. So we're going to start introducing the greens. Again, the more muted ones first. And this limited palette that I've created, I have to keep replenishing it. But I'm sticking to this range of color as far as I can, because the tighter you make your color, the stronger the feeling that it will convey, the more focused it will be. And one of the things that distinguishes a painting from just a literal photograph or something. Notice I have very thin color right now, and I can run one color wet right over another just to, I'm not seeking detail, I'm creating areas that are dominated by one or another color or by a mixture of them. For instance, that's here, and I'm going to start to block in some of the mid values of these leaves. Not everywhere, because some areas are going to be brighter. I might as well just leave that. And I'm not going to make any real, most of the leaves, I'm not going to make distinctions between them at this point. I'm going to just use 2 or 3 colors, a green for the middle value that I'm seeing on these leaves. Later, I'll have to find a color for the light coming through the leaves and another color for the light reflected off the leaves. That's the simplest way to approach greenery. Well, the hummingbird just buzzed me while I was off camera. Maybe it'll come back. And there's a cat. There's a lot of activity out here because there's a big pond which that I made that I'll show you later that just draws a huge number of animals. So I'm continuing to block in, mostly in terms of the general, still using my very limited palette, trying to find mixtures, but within that palette, which will create most of the painting. I have drawn a lot of stuff in, but it's just in order to establish generally where the colors are going to go. I'm not necessarily going to leave my drawing as is. I will paint over for a lot of things. Now, the other thing that's happening here is because we're out of doors and the light's changing fast. In fact, it's a particularly confounding day because 1 minute it's sunny, the next minute it's cloudy. And that makes it very hard, especially since I am interested in having the shadows. So when they're here, I'm putting them in. And of course, they're going to change too. So this is something that one has to take into account when one works outside. When one works outside, there's a certain improvisational nature to it. You have to relax and just do the best you can and accept the fact that nature's going to throw you a lot of curveballs, and you kind of have to like that experience if you're going to work outside, because it's invariably the case. Right now I'm getting some light, so I'm very quickly blocking in. Now I'm taking from the colors around the edge, but I'm keeping the colors within the limited palette range that I already established. The shadow on the horse's skull here is very similar in color to the gray paving stones, but it's a little bit cooler. So I'm going to work in some more of the blue-green that I have at the base here to make a shadow color for the skull. The fish from Michoacan is much warmer. It's about the same value, but it's considerably warmer. It's a stone that's very popular for carving in Michoacan, sort of with a slight rose tint to it. I think I'll just block in some of the leaves of the indigenous sage that's in this painting. That's a very cool blue-green, not particularly strong color. So I'm actually neutralizing it a little bit with the red.
Sorry about the glare on the palette.
And in the beginning, when you're blocking in, don't even think about whether it's a good or a bad painting. I'm certainly not. Just kind of block things in. It's interesting. In one of his letters to his brother, Van Gogh said that the way he started a painting was just to literally paint what he saw in front of his eyes. And then over time, he had ideas in his mind about what he wanted to do to it, and also the painting itself would start to dictate what you have to do. And I think that's a good way to approach it. Don't have a really strong preconceived notion. Areas that are fairly neutral, as you develop them, it makes sense to put on slightly varied color so that an even partially unmixed color and just work it around a little to make a vibration so that the area doesn't seem flat, dead. The worst thing is in areas where you want the neutral areas, fairly neutral areas where you want them to be light, to just leave it one flat color. It doesn't work. So I've got the dirt here, which it's not a particularly strong color, but it has elements of both green and sort of ochreish orange in it. So I'm using both those colors. And now I'm going to pick up the paving stones a little. Now I'm going to fix the shadows at this point on the light and shadow on the skull and the fish, because if the sun will hold for long enough. Again, I'm mixing from the outside, but I'm keeping within the restricted palette that I've already chosen for myself. I generally don't use pure white in my paintings, even when something is white. I load it with a little tiny bit of color, because that way it vibrates more, and that which says light better than if you just use white. Notice I'm laying on these areas of light with the palette knife. I can go back in later with the brush and clarify things, or even take stuff out if it becomes unmanageable. But it's the fastest way to get the color on there. And what I'm trying right now is to get a light shadow organization, which I'll stick with, even though the light is going to change radically on me in the next hour or two. As you go, you also modify the drawing a little, where you see that it may be a little bit off. You're not ever stuck with, you shouldn't ever feel stuck with the drawing that you started with. That leads to a painting that looks as if it's done paint by number. We don't want that. You don't want that, I presume. Or you wouldn't be studying. Put back the shadow a little bit, which is a slightly cooler red than the, I mean, it has a little red in it, but it's quite cool. Now, one of the things that interested me, one of the reasons I should say that I chose the green-red theme, apart from the fact that you have the red blocks and the green foliage, which embraces most of the, and the fact that the other colors can mostly be made out of these, is the fact that the blocks themselves have this green lichen on them, which is really very attractive and ties the scene together in kind of an interesting way. So I'm gonna block in this area here a little bit more. And I'm going to put some slightly stronger red on there, which is visible in places. It's a tone of red. It's a red mixed with a lot of gray and neutralized to some extent with the green. But then on top of that, I'm going to take some green. Now, if I'm going to, the green lichen is only slightly lighter. It's not a very strong color, so you have to be very careful. And in fact, as you can see, I mix it with some of the red to find it. See. Let's try this. I don't know if this will work, but it's not bad. And you want some of the red to show through. You don't want to work it on so heavily that you want to, as I was saying in my last demonstration, as much as possible when you lay knife color, palette knife color over palette knife color, you want to float it on rather than just scraping it on, because that if you scrape it on, especially on a smooth surface as I'm using, which is a prime wooden surface, you're just going to scrape off the other color. But in fact, what you want to do is to mix in a way that feels very natural. Oh, a little too light there. Now what I do is I establish areas and then I move on and come back to refine them, because very often I'm not sure what I think immediately. I need time to reflect on an area and think about it. That's nice. See, I'm going to have to brighten up the grass and the slope along here if I'm going to use these colors in here. I'll show you how I'll do that in a minute. Trick I use only outside and only with a mask, with a mask, well, actually a bandana and something protecting my eyes. So, having covered my face with a mask and wearing glasses and a cap, I'm going to do a little bit of splattering. And you have to control it as much as you can, and be careful that don't do this indoors, and protect your eyes and your mouth, because you don't want to absorb these pigments. But I can do this. See, and I can lighten up this area and also create a little bit of visual excitement there, which is quite appropriate for the dirt to have a little texture to it. But I'm lightening it up against the brick, the shade of the brick here, so that it makes sense. And I don't necessarily just use one color. The light is warm, so this sort of ochreish orange is good. But to make, because I have a lot of greenery here, I'm going to use a yellow green as well. This will also can be used to set off the leaves when I detail the more of the Indian sage, and pick up a little bit of the light up there. This can also be used on the wall to create the mixing of the color, the combination of the color of the wall and the color of the lichen. For a First, I'll put a little bit more of the wool color on. And then I'll go back in with the lichen. Now again, the lichen color should not be as light as this. Similar color, but it's darker than the yellow-green that I used on the pad. I'm going to model the skull some more with the palette knife. It's because it's a sort of light neutral gray, with lichen on it. It moves between warm and cool. And I'm putting in some cool notes first. I've already established these strong notes to the shadows. And after I've done that, I'm going with some slightly warmer notes. About the same value, okay? Because we don't want to break up the surface with different colors. I'm going to go into the lid area on the skull, which I'll put in a warm note first, and then I'll go back over it with the lichen color. It's brighter because it's in the sunlight, obviously. And one wants to get the color a little bit more saturated there too, to indicate that it's in the light. Now I'm going to put the lichen on top of that. I'm going to go back in with some highlights. There are many issues when you work outside. One of them is to know what direction the sun's going, how long you will have the shadows you want, and figuring out how you're going to work in their absence. I still have both my objects mostly in the foreground, mostly in shadow, but I want to detail them more or less still mostly in shadow, because the light's gonna shift soon. In fact, there's going to be a point sometime in the next hour where I need to stop and I need to pick up again tomorrow. I've already been out here for, well, actually painting probably for about an hour, but I was out here for quite a while before that, setting up and choosing my subject. I lost a bit of time, but tomorrow I can set up a little bit earlier. As I said, you have to some degree, float the color in there. Now, I'm not saying you should necessarily work this way. I'm showing you how I work. I'm giving you the keys to working that way if you want. I would hope that with time you develop totally your own way of working, which might take elements of what I do and you introduce elements that you've figured out on your own. Because just imitating another artist, well, you probably get a nice, fairly good product, but it won't really be you. And I do hope that ultimately all of you get to paint pictures which really reflect who you are and how you see the world. I've pretty much got the fish the way I'm going to have it, but notice that apart from the shadows, there are little highlights where the fish turns, where the form of the fish turns beyond the shadow. And that's cool, because why? Because it's picking up the skylight. One of the things when you paint outside is you've got to be very aware of how colors are reflected and what things are reflecting those colors. The sky, you've got sunlight, which tends to be warm, somewhere between a yellow, orange. You've got skylight, which manifests very strongly in the shadows, but is also sometimes visible elsewhere. That is what gives that sense of immediacy and the outdoors to the painting, is to pay attention to those things and indicate them in your painting. I'm also indicating those cooler. I'm still within the palette I've established. I'm using a blue-green, not a blue, even though the sky is blue, to stick within my palette that I established. May veer out of it later, but at the moment I'm still able to get the effects I want with this restricted palette. What I'm doing now is I'm putting some of those skylight on where I see it on the skull. This gives it dimension. These paying attention to these variations is what creates the dimensions in the shadows and elsewhere in the painting. I changed the location to the painting itself so you can see more closely what I've been doing and what I will be doing. Now the light has changed radically, as is the case outdoors. I was sort of prepared for this. I knew where the shadows were going to go. I actually like the shadows on the ground around the leaves here that are cast by the leaves. So even though it's inconsistent from a literal point of view, I'm gonna block in some of those shadows because they definitely add to the composition. I'm also going to work on I'm going to work in a minute on the foliage of the sage. And then I will probably stop for today because, there's a point where I can't work even. The changes in light are just too great and I have to stop. So I will be, and then I will continue tomorrow. But there's some nice things happening in the sage. There's light on the leaves, some of the leaves. And also the other thing is I'm sticking as much as I can within the range of the palette that I created, but I'm expanding the saturation colors at this point. And for the lights, I need some nice, clean, saturated tints, which is just as pure a color as I can make, mixed just with white. Now, the light on these leaves of the sage are some of them are, the leaves themselves without light on them are actually quite cool, but with light on them, they get a little bit warmer and yellower. But they also, and this is something that's quite interesting, some of them are reddish, some of them quite strongly red. And that, again, ties into the color scheme that I've already established here. So you'll see I'll start putting that in. Now, I'm not going to put all the leaves in. I mean, there's no point. What you need is what I try to do is give a sense. Well, there's two things. I want to create a strong composition using all the elements of the painting. I also want to be able to suggest the nature and the movement of the plant. So I focus on that. But having done that, I can, if I do that with the key elements, the key leaves, I can leave the rest out. Up the top here, we're getting into, and again, I'm going to have to now use purer tints than I had on my palette before, but in the same, as much as possible, within the same range of color. Notice that in this painting, there's no pure yellow, there's no pure blue. There's no violet to speak of either. It's limited to the kind of red into red orange and blue green into a sort of well, yellowish green. One further observation before I stop for today, because the light has just changed too much. When you're working in a shadow area and you're putting another color in there, you want to generally make sure that the values are the same. In other words, the same lightness or darkness, so you don't violate your shadow organization. Now, I have put in some slightly brighter notes because there are some bits of straw and stuff in there, but the grass is the same value as the, so if I'm going to put any of that green in there, you notice it's the same value. I don't know if you can even see it on the screen, but it's the same value. So you make sure before you put your color down that you're using the same value. Otherwise, you break up your light shadow scheme really quickly. And I think that's about all I'm going to do today, because the degree to which things have changed, I'm going to come back around 2 o'clock tomorrow and work until probably around 4:30 or however long it takes to finish. At this point, a lot of what I'm doing is just refining things and using the same colors, expanding the colors a little bit further. For instance, I'm now both making the colors a little stronger than before for emphasis, and also expanding the range slightly, moving slightly outside of the palette, but only in certain areas, like here where there's a cool, almost violetish reflected light. One of the problems I'm having today, and one of the reasons I've been delaying videotaping, is the sun has not come back. And of course, this is one of the issues with painting outside, and you have to learn to work around it. There's some birds right around us here. There are some in a nest, and the fledglings are almost ready to fly. But getting back to the painting, one of the ways to move the eye in a painting is to shift hues. And one thing, it's already beginning to happen on the path. It was something that I saw yesterday. I'm going to illustrate a little bit what I'm doing here. I begin with a warmish brown in the foreground, working the details with that. See, I'm overworking what I did yesterday, and I'll go back in with some splatter probably. And as I go back, I'm shifting warm color a little bit more towards a yellow orange, which reaches its peak in the back, in the distance, which will draw the eye into the distance. I do the same with the greens, so that the two are working together to draw your eye back. The greens in the front are going to be bluish, blue-green. And as I move back, I'm going to shift to a slightly more of a yellow-green. I don't know if this is obvious in the video, but I am shifting hues here. And then as I get all the way into the back, there was, I mean, there isn't today, but there was a kind of pool of light in the very back. And I go to the strongest yellow-green, all of which kind of welcomes the eye up the path and creates a kind of a distant, the illusion of a distant space in contrast to the strong emphasis of the objects right in the foreground. To emphasize a shadow, and I don't always do this, and it depends on the composition. If you run along the edge of the shadow, a cool color against a warm color. Now the cool color is in the shadow and it should be the same value as the shadow itself. The warm color can be very slightly, and it should to some extent represent the light that's out there. The warm color can be lighter, though it should relate to the lit surface. It should be about the value of the lit surface. See, immediately this shadow becomes more emphatic. A lot of people think that Thiebaud invented this, but he uses it, and I think he uses it sometimes too much for my taste. But it was actually the running of warm and cool shadow light against along the edge of shadows was actually an innovation of the post-impressionists, the Pointillists in particular, Seurat.
Mm.
So I'd hoped to talk at length about painting leaves and the lighting on leaves, the direct local color of the leaf, the sunlight on the leaf, and the light coming through a leaf. But I've had almost no sun today. Bursts of sun so short that I couldn't really demonstrate anything. And furthermore, looking at this painting, I realized that I need to keep this area fairly subdued. It's already very strong just with that intense green there. If I go into the strong lighting and shadowing, which I was originally intending to do, it will throw off the whole composition of the painting. It will draw too much attention over there. So I'm not going to do that.
So that is the finished painting. So actually a little dark, darker than it really is. But that's where I took the painting to. So any questions, or observations, or whatever? Sorry that was so long.
No, it wasn't long at all, actually.
It's very impressive, and it's nice to see your progression.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, well, I tried to make it I tried to just take those snippets where I was saying something that you could, demonstrating something that was of value. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, the lighting out there took me by surprise, especially the glare on the palette. I wasn't aware that I was getting that because I just have a camera in a fixed position and then I keep painting. And I turn it on and off. But I hope you could still, from what I was saying, get the logic of what I was doing.
I got the logic of it, but it was kind of hard to see the actual colors that you're applying, and I wish I
Yes.
could have seen more colors. And
Yeah.
also the area, I think you took the palette knife and then you put on your scarf. I couldn't understand what you were doing there. It's kind of spraying,
Splattering.
splatter, and
Paint.
I couldn't see that on the canvas.
You can see it now, actually, in places. You can see the splatter. It's not as strong now as it was. But I do that to modify colors, to create a vibrancy. It's just paint mixed with a fair amount of thinner, loaded on the brush, and then the brush pulled against the palette knife, pushed against the palette knife.
Brush pulled against the palette knife.
Just run against the palette knife. You have to experiment to do it. It's like people
Hmm.
do that with a toothbrush sometimes, to
Hmm.
splatter. But I just, you need a bristle brush too. You can't use a soft brush.
I see. And also, my question is, when do you decide to use palette knife as opposed to brush? Even like a fine area, I'm sure you could highlight it with a small brush, but you use palette knife. How do you make the decision?
Well, I use palette knife to cover areas where I want variation in color, and I'm just going to push one color through the other.
So
So
for blending purpose?
yeah, I don't always decide. I just do it. There's no rule. There are no rules here.
Okay.
But I tend to use after I've blocked things in with a very thin layer of paint, I'll go back over with a palette knife. Sometimes I'll go over areas that haven't got any paint on them.
Hmm.
And you can, with practice, you can put on a thin layer of paint with the brush, 1 or 2 layers with the palette knife, but you have to work the paint to the right consistency with thinner.
Hmm.
And then finally you can touch up with the brush, because there was stuff in here that was touched up ultimately with the brush, and also with the palette knife. You can kind of see that there was a lot of palette knife work in
Yes.
these leaves over here.
Yes. Yes.
At some point you were working in the lower left and talking about making sure that you're using the same value.
Yeah, well, okay. Here's a shadow that's warm. See the green there in the shadow?
Yes.
The shadow is that warm reddish brown, but I wanted to put some of the greenery in. I was making sure that the green was the same value.
Oh,
Because
okay.
you don't want to break up. You don't want to break up your shadows. So if you're going to put a variation of color in a shadow, you keep them the same value. And then when I put in the slight, I was talking about, actually, I don't think Cassandra heard this, but I was putting a little cool along the edge of the shadow and a little warmer on the outside. The cool that I put along the edge of the shadow has to be the same value as the shadow. The warm has to be closer to the value of the lit surface, which is a technique that Thibaut popularized, but as I mentioned, was actually something he got it from the post-impressionists, from the pointillists. They were the ones who did it first, establish that. But it creates more of a sense of vibration between shadow and light. I didn't want to do it too much because but I just want to do a little. It also helps to lead the eye back. Because the feeling I wanted in this was that I wanted the foreground to be very strong, but that to have a background that was pulling against that. So there's almost the sense you could walk up the path.
You talk about like changing colors and not always painting exactly what you see.
Right.
I found that this looks a lot like the reality. Can you talk about a little bit what you modified and
let me find, just a second. How can I do that? Let's see. I can go back to the original. Well, first of all, make it down in size. Oh, I have to do that, don't I? Well, I can do this. I can bring up the photograph there, and this one actually is closer to the actual painting. It's a little, that other.
Right.
Okay. So there you are. You can see it's related, but I've shifted the colors.
Yeah.
I've paid a lot more. I've really intensified the reds and the whole dialogue of red and green in the painting.
Yeah.
I've made the skull and the fish a little bit more dominant in the scene too. So they become almost emblematic in this painting. They're more casual over here.
When you started it, Anthony, your canvas was blocking the path and the plant that's to the right side. So the only thing that we could see is, you know, the bricks and the skeleton and the.
Yeah, well, I couldn't. You see, because I wanted.
You couldn't see what you were, you know, what you were painting at the other side.
You can't.
When you started, so I wasn't. You know, I did until you know, showed the second portion of the, you know, where you show the path and.
The problem is that if you're gonna, in the beginning I wanted to show the palette as well as the painting, and that, you know, there wasn't space for anything else. But unfortunately, I was showing the palette, but there was glare on it that I wasn't aware of. At a certain point, in the beginning it was fine, but later there was glare that was making all the colors look white.
Those shadows, Anthony, I thought I heard you saying, because it looks very violet, but I thought you said that there was no like kind of violet or purple. Are those mixed neutrals that you did for the shadows? I didn't quite catch that.
The shadows are made up of the red, brown, and the blue, green.
Okay.
Which, yeah, in this context, they start to almost look like they might be violet, but they're not. There is a touch in here and a touch of a kind of a purple just on that corner there. Those are the two places where I varied slightly from my palette because I wanted emphasis down here.
Do you kind of start laying in the do you always start kind of with the mid-range?
Yes.
Okay.
Because then because the mid-range is where your shadows are going to be, and the light shadow organization creates the composition. And then you don't want the super dark colors, unless the whole paint is going to be dark. You want to be very careful where you put them because they draw the eye. Emphasis here, and a final emphasis up here. So the eye goes, hopefully something like that. It goes from the skull down to the fish and up the path like that. It's important to, when you paint a picture, how is the eye going to move through the picture? You know, it's important to think about that. You don't have, I mean, well, I do anyway. It's something that really interests me. I think I could have done a little bit more specific development on a few of these leaves up here. Some of them are a little too sketchy, but I felt the painting as a whole was working and I wanted to leave it there. So, any other questions or observations?
I love the stones, the red stones or rocks or the stand.
Well, this palette actually comes from my painting in Mexico so much.
It's beautiful.
Where they use this color, they use this red. Well, it's actually this red, which is stronger when you see it and it's lit than you see in this photograph, because this photograph was when there was almost no sun, really strong sunlight. But I got into using a red-green palette in Mexico. It seemed very appropriate to the experience there. And it's a red-green. Well, what did Van Gogh say? When he painted the Night Cafe, he said, I'm doing it mostly in reds and greens. Those colors.
Night Cafe?
Huh?
The night cafe, he did it in red and green?
The interior one.
Oh, okay,
He
okay.
said because it's a place where people go who he said it's a place where people go who are very upset, and the reds and greens represent those terrible things, the human passions.
Mm.
And of course, red is blood and green is chlorophyll.
Green is what?
Chlorophyll, they're both the
Oh,
life
chlorophyll.
color, they're the
Oh,
life colors,
I
as
see.
opposed to the rarefied contrast of blue and
Mm.
yellow, or blue and yellow orange. So
Well, I think it's beautiful here anyway, either way. Mm.
no, I actually felt that it worked out pretty well.
Yes, yes, beautiful.
It's really
Shell was a little odd because the animals that come into the garden gnaw on it. One day there'll just be a little pile of bone dust here.
It's helpful to see how much you exaggerate the color. Like I know what Cassandra's saying, and it's like it looks really realistic, but when you
Yeah.
look at it next to the photo, it's very exaggerated. It's very dramatized. It's
Yeah.
really interesting. I don't know. There's just a lot
Yeah.
from watching.
Well, you want to focus on conveying an emotion and carrying the emotion. And I like my work to be based on my experience, but the painting should take you somewhere. That's so, yeah. And yeah, people look at my paintings, they say, oh, it's just like a photograph. If they think that, that's fine, but they're not.
They're not, no.
It's not, yeah.
I don't think yours are like photographs, Anthony. I think burrows are. They look like photographs, but yours aren't.
Yeah, well, I get that on the street a lot, though.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
But, people don't observe very carefully.
Right,
I
right.
just think it looks as accurate as a photograph.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
that's what they mean,
Also,
Maybe that's what they mean, yeah.
when you're outside too, if you're in bright light, it doesn't seem as extreme.
Right.
Right.
So that context makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, this photograph is when there wasn't bright light. That's the other thing that's different. Unfortunately, I took photographs the first day when there was bright light, and there was something wrong with the exposure. So anyway, so both of these, the one I did last week, which was more about Rembrandt's palette and chiaroscuro, and this one are both going to be archived on the YouTube. So if you want, you can look at them again if you want tips from them. I'm probably not going to do another full painting. As I said, I'll do more little demonstrations of things.
Okay.
But the next 2 weeks, I will be doing artists again.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure who yet, but there's a lot of people to choose from. But the same period that we'd already been doing. And as we come, this is all going to come eventually into the modern period, and you'll see a kind of logical evolution that happens in the way artists approach things. I might do Albrecht Dürer next week, who's he's a very interesting painter who also was not Italian, but spent time in Italy and was very influenced by Italy. Brilliant draftsman. So